The Chapel. A short story, by KPF. The wind howled through the trees outside of town on a cold winter night. All was dark except for the moonlight, which permeated the vast expanse of woodland almost supernaturally. Feeling the cool breeze on his face, an old man walked quietly alongside the path leading to an abandoned chapel. Crows watched his every move, and because so, made him feel as if the trees were looking at him. He walked for roughly an hour before reaching his destination, and as he did, found himself hurrying to get inside. He shut the door behind him and crept through the little building suspiciously as if anticipating the chapel to be occupied by some unknown entity. To his relief, he found the place to be empty and proceeded to settle in amongst the silence of the woods. Tired from his excursion, he slowly drifted away into a deep sleep, which seemed to last him quite some time. As he slept, he dreamt of his journey to the chapel and of how the trees made him feel, a stalking presence that haunted him every time he made this pilgrimage. A couple of hours later and he was awake. The man sat up delicately and began to gather his bearings, and immediately sensed something was amiss. Not quite sure what it was, he cautiously stood up to investigate. As he did, every hair on the back of his neck stood up too, as he was filled with instant terror. A deceased nun was staring blankly at him with piercing black eyes that did not blink, nor move away from the old man. Frozen with fear, and not being able to talk, the man began to faint almost immediately, but adrenaline prevented him from doing so. His heart had felt like it could explode any minute, and he was left with no choice but to confront the nun, either using physicality or through spoken word. Before he could break free from his paralysis, however, the nun had seemingly vanished without a trace. Not wanting to spend another second in the chapel by himself, and without having done what he meant to do there, he was at odds with himself about what to do next. However, the sheer horror that had just unfolded was enough for him to grab his things and leave. It was early morning, and the fog was illuminated by the ghastly sun. The air was crisp and seemed to slap him in the face once he stepped out of that wretched place. He could smell the dampness of the grass and began to walk in the opposite direction of which he came, not wanting anything to do with the chapel, nor the place he was before that. He needed to find somewhere else to perform his ritual, somewhere that didn't include other human beings, or any other kind of being for that matter. He made his way through the woods, navigating through dense patches of trees and bush with no destination other than a secluded area away from any towns or villages. He had just woken up and was starved, so he reached into his satchel to grab something to eat when he felt it again. "Those trees have eyes," he muttered to himself and kept walking. The man was old, and his bones cracked as he made way through the woods, hoping to find some type of shelter that was either abandoned or unoccupied, for his ceremony needed complete isolation. Eventually, the trees gave way to open land, and he found himself staring at a seemingly endless field, which looked tantalizingly like a haven for his ritual. He walked about a mile out into the middle of the land and stopped to look around him. He was completely alone. The man found a spot on the ground and sat down, cross-legged and upright. He closed his eyes and focused on the vast emptiness seen behind his eyelids. In doing so, he calmed his mind and began to visualize his life, from his birth to his present age. His mind drifted through memories of young and old, dancing around past experiences, until he felt certain in himself, and who he was. All of this was a necessity for what was about to come. Confident in his recollection of both past and present, the blackness of his vision slowly began to fade into a brilliant white light. Everything that made him human evaporated into nothingness in a split second, and his consciousness was thrust into another dimension, a realm familiar to Earth but only to those who dream. He was now astral traveling. The purpose for all of this was shrouded by the thought of the nun. for the man could not make his mind think of anything else. His original intention had been to make contact with his family, all of which are deceased. No matter how much he tried to visualize them, he could not bring forth their presence. He began to become more and more frustrated at this until his mind finally gave in to the thought of her completely. Pure terror, the likes of which the poor man had never felt before, was now bestowed upon him. He was back in the abandoned chapel, standing where he was when he first saw the nun. Before he could do anything, she lunged forward at him, causing him to recoil and hit the wall behind him. She was now on his face, and he could smell the rotting flesh hanging off of her bones. "What do you want?" the man shouted. "Get away from me, you demon." At this she snapped, letting out a blood-curdling scream that made the man's ears bleed. Her breath smelled like absolute death, and the man gagged at the thought of it, then proceeded to violently vomit. Gasping for breath when he was finished, he wiped his mouth and made eye contact with the entity. Suddenly, he witnessed something he had never experienced before. He saw her whole life from start to finish, just as he had done with himself in the field. It was almost as if she forced it onto him, and the experiences and memories he felt moved the man deeply until one single tear rolled down his cheek. Still staring at the nun, he felt sympathy for her, and they both began to weep. Man and demon intertwined in a dazzling display of emotion. One must have thought the man crazy for sympathizing with such unholiness, but after seeing the nun shed tears as much as he came to realize the nature of her intentions. She was no demon. She was trapped in a realm similar to the man's, void of companionship and full of loneliness. All of a sudden, the man's vision started fading to black, and he found himself sitting in the field again by himself. Standing up, he felt lightheaded, as he usually does when astral traveling, and began to head back to where he had originally come from. As he walked, he couldn't get out of his mind the thought of the nun and what she had been through, her life being considerably similar to his in regards to pain, tragedy, and suffering. He felt a bond between them like he had felt with no other person before. One that was rooted in the twisted darkness of reality but yet fragile and innocent at the same time. He desperately wanted to make contact with the nun again. He decided to go back to the chapel. Upon entering the rundown building, the man called out to the spirit who had visited him, calling her out by her first name, which he had learned to be Anna. Yes. A faint voice arose from out of thin air, along with the apparition of a nun. The man's eyes widened and his jaw dropped at the sight of her. She was dressed in her uniform, but this time she smelled like fresh-cut flowers and looked as if she was the man's exact age. Her skin was of a light complexion and looked healthy, and she stood there with arms outstretched waiting for their embrace. This time would be different though, as Anna appeared to have been freed from her suffering in the afterlife, and very well alive and breathing. The man leaped without hesitation to greet her, and yet again they embraced. "I've longed for someone to see the beauty in me," Anna said, almost with sorrow. "I've seen you come to the chapel plenty of times before to perform your ritual, and I have witnessed the love you have shown for your family. I wanted you, and only you, to be the one to set me free, to make me whole again, how I was before the earth had consumed most of my decaying flesh." The man again was moved to tears, but managed to hold them back just long enough to say, "But why me?" Anna need not answer, for he already knew the answer to his question. The two were soulmates. Separated between life and death, lovers from another time. The man vaguely recalled their relationship together in a past life whilst watching the woman's life flash before his. He saw himself in memories with her, doing things only soulmates would do. He looked at her, with tears still in his eyes, and said only 3 words, "I love you." The two made love like animals. Having spent an entire lifetime away from her man, Anna had finally found her other half. You see, after his past life, the man reincarnated, leaving Anna behind in the afterlife. She wasn't ready to experience life again, and the final words that were exchanged between them were, "Maybe in another life we will find each other. Until then I will always love you." They laid in bed and reminisced for a while, then gently fell into a deep slumber, both having dreams of one another. They woke up the next morning and talked for a little, then decided to find something to eat. The man had brought food with him on his initial journey to the chapel, but had since run out, leaving him especially hungry. The only food available to eat, other than wildlife, was back at the man's cabin in town. The man slung his satchel over his shoulder and the two proceeded to make their way back home. Upon arrival, they found it surprisingly empty, with nobody riding their horses, nobody in their houses, and nobody at the market. The man shrugged it off as no big deal, still under the love spell cast upon him by his former lover. They made their way through town talking and laughing like children, giddy as a young couple in love for the first time. Very little attention was paid to the atmosphere around them, and little did they know, something evil was waiting for them. The man opened the door to his cabin and they both stepped foot into a dark, cold, and wooden house. He proceeded to light a total of 4 lamps, all of which were positioned in the corners of the main room. When the light found the walls, Anna shrieked in horror, and proclaimed loudly, "It can't be." Anna became a nun after death, due to not having her husband with her in the afterlife. She did so in hopes of regaining some of her innocence back, and in a way she did, that is, until she became desperately alone. Sadness quickly turned into anger, and anger into a rage, and rage into a burning fire that filled her soul with absolute and utter violence. She had all about given up after years of suffering when she happened to come across a man who felt surprisingly similar to the soul she felt so lost without. She first saw him in the chapel where she stayed, but was reluctant to make contact with him as he was projecting his consciousness out into the spirit realm to communicate and spend time with his family. During her time as a nun, she vowed complete celibacy. She was still not ready to forgive him, for he had left her to be alone for all eternity. Having since reunited, and now standing in the dim-lit room with the old man, who had previously felt the same terror that Anna now feels, she quickly shut her eyes and whispered a quick prayer to herself. "O Lord, be with me, for there is uncertainty in the air, and something the likes of which I cannot explain in front of me." The man, now visibly uneasy, turned to his lover and asked her what she was talking about. Then, almost as if in a trance or a state of shock, the woman pointed to one of the corners in the room and said without color, "Look, it is standing right there, but be cautious as to not look into its eyes, for they are filled with an emptiness far greater than what you can ever imagine." The man nervously turned his head to where she had pointed and instantly felt his blood run cold. Standing in the corner of the room was a tall, lanky humanoid, well dressed in a black suit darker than any other black he had ever seen, with a long skinny neck and hands like talons that gave him chills down his spine. His skin was almost as dark as his suit, and the old man dared not to venture his eyes upon the entity. Almost subconsciously, he knew what the being represented, and had not a clue what to do next. The only thing he could think of was to pray. "Ha, you mortal fool!" barked the figure, crushing any hope that was obtained through the man's praying. "You think that by praying to your God that he will come and help you? Look at you, afraid to even look a man in both his eyes." The being stepped into the middle of the room towards the couple ever so gently, in a pace that was eerily similar to that of a predator stalking its prey. "I see you have finally found your lady. What a nice surprise to see that she is back in the physical realm once more." He said this maliciously, intending to try to rouse the old man, who kept his eyes down and his mouth shut. "Oh, so you are a mute. Good. Now listen to me." "No, you listen to me," proclaimed the nun. "Silence, you hag. You have no power nor any authority to speak to me in such a manner. Be like your husband and keep quiet, for I have a very important message for you." Anna and the man both looked at each other for a moment. Then she said solemnly, "You may proceed." The entity reached into his back pocket and produced a small envelope stamped with a red seal of a snake consuming itself. He handed it to the nun and told her, "Take this and return to the chapel from which you have stayed immediately, but do not break the seal until you do so. If you disobey this one simple rule, all of hell will rain down upon both of you with a vengeance the likes of which the human mind cannot possibly fathom. Do not return to this cabin, for the occupants of your town are no longer with us. Take whatever supplies you need and leave immediately. You will see that you make it to the chapel by nightfall, and once the hour on the clock has struck 12, then, and only then, may you open the letter." The two turned toward each other and reluctantly told the being, "Thy will be done." He seemed to like that. Upon arriving at the bleak, old, and withering chapel just hours before midnight, Anna and the man marveled at the sight of the ancient building. "I always enjoyed coming here," said the man gleefully. "It reminds me of home, a place I seldomly reside." Anna looked at him with admiration. "I no longer can wear this uniform," she said, "for I am with you once more." The man smiled at this and reached for her hand. "My love, I am sorry for the pain and hurt I must have put you through. It was not my intention to do so. I merely wanted to experience life again, and should have waited until you were ready to do the same." To which she replied, "My dear, do not be so tough on your conscience. You only did what you felt necessary. The only thing that matters now is that we are together once more. May we die in each other's arms and spend eternity with one another, for I have longed to do so for centuries." The man threw his arms around her, and they embraced for quite some time. "Let's get this gown off you," he told her, with a devilish smile. "We have some time to kill." Anna felt accomplished after having intercourse with her man, proud of the fact that she was still beautiful enough to arouse him, and the fact that he was able to perform the way he did at his age. She lay next to him and they both were transfixed on the night sky, for the chapel's roof was missing. "I wonder what time it is," said the man, pulling out a pocket watch from his satchel. It was about 30 minutes to midnight, and he anticipated with creeping anxiety opening that dreadful letter. What must it be that is so important that the very epitome of hell had to deliver it personally to us? He thought to himself aloud. The hour arose, it doesn't seem to be from who had delivered the message. Certainly, the writer must be of some greater significance. He went on rambling for a couple of minutes more, finally stopping after he exhausted all plausible explanations. The time was almost upon them to break the seal, and his hands were sweaty at the thought of taking his knife to the mystic envelope. Still, they waited for the midnight hour to arrive. 11:55. The man was completely unnerved looking at his watch, counting the seconds so that time would appear to move slower for him. The woman held the letter, running her finger over the stamped wax that sealed their fate. It was time to find out what was inside, and who it had come from. "Give me the letter, my love," said the man softly, outstretching his arm towards her. He took his knife, and as to not cut or tear the fragile envelope, slid it under the seal carefully, examining his movements ever so gently. As it broke through the other side, there was an ominous sound, almost like the sound of rushing water billowing from the letter. An ancient mist arose from it, and occupied the tiny chapel with ease, with an aroma consisting of scents the couple could not recognize. It had an oldness to it, and the only thing they could guess the smell to be was something of otherworldly proportions. They both sat and simultaneously laid eyes upon the letter when they noticed something odd. The piece of paper the man held in his hands was blank. "It can't be," said the man, in complete denial of what his eyes were telling him. Surely there must be some form of communication. They both sat bewildered at the thought that an entity such as the one that had appeared at the cabin delivered them a blank note, with specific instruction on when, and where, to open it. "This makes no sense, Anna," the old man said, completely defeated. He had worked himself up over the opening of this seemingly important envelope and felt a sense of dissatisfaction eating away at his soul. Then before he knew it, the fog that had filled the room suddenly found its way to the paper he held, magically forming into words and sentences. The sound of water now sounded reversed, as if it were being sucked back into the letter itself. To their astonishment, all of the mist was gone, the roaring sound of water too. They both leaned in to read the message that seemed to be burnt into the piece of paper and held hands as they did. They felt a sense of both excitement and adrenaline, not knowing what to expect as they started reading, and soon found themselves outright petrified. The letter had stated, "To whom it may concern. And with great sorrow must I inform thee, that to whoever receives this letter shall hereby face immediate execution, through means of both crucifixion and immolation, at the hands of each recipient." The letter did not contain a signature. The couple shot a vivid glance at each other and without hesitation started panicking into oblivion. They sat there beside one another frantically trying to make sense of what they had just read. Then, almost in an instant before they could read it again, the letter disintegrated into tiny particles of smoke, causing the man to gasp as it fell through his hands. "Oh God, why must we bear this fate?" the man cried. "Have not I been a loyal companion to you? I beg of thee, to hear my prayer of salvation, dear Lord, for my life as well as the life of my beautiful wife is now in your hands." Anna looked away from the man as he begged for mercy from the heavenly Creator. She could not stand to see him in such disarray, for she knew the purpose behind the haunting message, and what it meant for them if they didn't follow through with the task at hand. Part of her felt complicit and guilty, for, unbeknownst to the man, she hid a dark and sinister secret in the back of her mind that bothered her profusely. "I have to confess something to you, my love, and please try to understand and comprehend my perspective in its entirety, for if not, you and I will become instantly separated in the worst of ways. Whilst I was in limbo, I became increasingly and utterly hopeless about my lack of companionship. Having not felt your presence for centuries on end, I began to stray away from the Catholic teachings that I immersed myself in, and slowly found myself possessed by the fury of loneliness and anger. One night at the chapel, as I lay in torment, I heard 3 distinct knocks on the window. Having not the time to respond, nor the courage to investigate, the door swung on its hinges ever so slightly, steadily creaking until it came to a rest against the wall of the chapel. I looked up in total horror of what I may find entering the building. She paused for a moment, briefly thought about if she should tell him or not, then continued, stating, "The entity that gave us the letter walked through the doorway into the chapel and transfixed his eyes upon mine, revealing the emptiness that lay within his glare. I wasn't able to concurrently wrap my head around what I was looking at, but when I took my eyes away from the being, I understood. My dear, he offered me another chance at life so that I may see you again, under only one circumstance, that I was to spend but just one full day with you before we both met an unknown, predetermined fate. This he had kept a secret from me, but I agreed, in hopes that the ending of our story be a happy one. I did not know what lay in wait for us, and I assure you, that my intentions were of purity and void of any malintent." The man let out a mournful sigh of disappointment and sorrow. He sat in silence for a few moments, his head in hand, and began to weep. He wept deeply and with remorse for what she had done, not being able to help but feel as if this were his fault too. After all, he had left her in limbo to reincarnate, whilst she left limbo to do the very same thing he had done, but in the name of love. I forgive you, my precious Anna. I am happy to trade my entire life for having spent one day with you again. At which she replied, how are we going to crucify ourselves? The man thought long and hard at the question but could not find a reasonable method of nailing one another to a cross, stating, my love, perhaps the crucifixion is just a metaphor. After all, need the being think that the two of us could do such a thing? She pondered his remark with tantalizing enthusiasm. Two people couldn't climb onto a cross and nail themselves onto it, let alone each other. This, coupled with the fact that they also needed to consume themselves with fire, disproved the notion of the letter entirely, and they began to ponder what the message meant. Crucifixion. Immolation. At the hands of each recipient.